Welcome back, and thank you for tuning in to Midnight Affairs Tales. We appreciate every single one of you. We'd love to know what part of the world you are watching from right now. Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story, Chapter 1. The night was black as ink when the sound of gunfire split the silence like a blade. Daniel Reed jerked awake, sweat streaming down his forehead. In the darkness of his bedroom, he could still hear it. That single, devastating crack of a rifle that had ended his son's life. James, he rasped, the name tearing from his throat like a prayer and a curse all at once. His hands trembled as he reached for the photograph on the nightstand. A snapshot of James in uniform, that proud smile that always lit up the room. Now, it felt like a ghost grin. The world outside was calm, but Daniel's mind was a battlefield. His son's laughter echoed in his ears, overlaid with the brutal report of gunfire. He pressed his palm against the photo, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, son. I couldn't protect you." In that moment, he remembered every detail of that fateful night when two officers in pressed uniforms had come to his door. They'd said it was a training accident. Their eyes had been cold, their voices mechanical, and Daniel had known, deep in his gut, that something was wrong. They spoke in clipped, official tones, offering condolences that felt like a punch to the chest. "It was an accident," they'd said. "It wasn't your fault," they'd insisted. But those words were as hollow as the grave they'd put his son in. Daniel's fists clenched, his breath ragged. "No," he whispered to the empty room. "This wasn't an accident, and I'm going to prove it." The silence that followed was deafening. In the shadows of that room, Daniel Reed vowed to find out what really happened on that training ground, even if it meant tearing down every lie they'd built to bury his son's memory. "Before we move ahead, I just want to say, your support truly means everything. We're building something special here, and our next big goal is reaching 10,000 incredible subscribers. If you're feeling the emotions in these stories, imagine what's still to come. Subscribe now, be part of this amazing journey, and let's keep growing together. Your one click can make a real difference." Let's continue the story. The next morning, the world outside looked the same, but inside Daniel's heart, everything had shifted. The kettle whistled on the stove, but he couldn't hear it over the echo of that single shot. He poured black coffee into a chipped mug, the steam rising like a ghost from the cup. He took a sip, but it tasted like ashes. On the table lay the official report, neat lines of text that spelled out his son's death in the cold language of bureaucracy. "Accidental discharge," it read. "Fatal injury sustained." Daniel's eyes burned as he read the words over and over again, his mind refusing to accept them. He'd read that report 100 times since James died, and each time it felt like he was reading a stranger's story. Because he knew his son. James was careful. James was disciplined. James didn't just die in an accident. Someone had killed him. Daniel traced the words with his finger, feeling the paper's texture like a scar across his soul. He noticed something new this time, a name buried in the footnotes. A name he didn't recognize, Lieutenant Harmon. It felt like a crack in the facade, a whisper of the truth peeking through. His pulse quickened. "Who are you, Lieutenant Harmon?" he murmured. "What did you do to my boy?" The weight of grief pressed down on his chest, but underneath it was something hotter, a spark of anger that refused to die. He reached for his phone, dialing the last number James had called before he died. A woman's voice answered, tight and cautious. "Hello. Sarah, it's Daniel," he said. "I need to know what really happened. Don't lie to me." There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath. I can't talk about it," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I can't." The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, his jaw tightening. He would find the truth, even if it was buried under a mountain of secrets. 2 weeks later, Daniel stood in the biting November wind at the memorial service for his son. The flag flapped listlessly on its pole, the ceremony's solemn words ringing hollow in his ears. He watched the young soldiers stand stiffly in formation, medals glinting in the pale sunlight. Their faces were blank, but their eyes darted away from him, as if the truth was written in the lines of his grief. Daniel scanned the crowd. searching for any flicker of honesty in those carefully arranged rows of uniforms. A young soldier, maybe 19, with haunted eyes, fidgeted nervously at the end of the line. Their gazes met for a split second before he looked away, his lips pressed tight. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream at them, to force the truth out of every tight-lipped mouth in that field, but he held it in. This wasn't the time. The chaplain's voice rose, calling out James's name with forced solemnity. Daniel's heart clenched. He watched as they folded the flag with mechanical precision, presenting it to him with trembling hands. He took it, his fingers brushing the fabric that once flew above his son's casket. It felt like an insult and a comfort all at once. James Reed. Gone but never forgotten, the chaplain intoned. Daniel's jaw tightened. He'll never be forgotten, he said under his breath. But I'll make damn sure he's remembered for the truth, not your lies. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel lingered by the memorial plaque. His eyes burned as he traced the engraved letters of his son's name. A young woman in civilian clothes approached, her eyes wide with sorrow. She leaned close, voice hushed. Mr. Reed, there's something you need to know. Meet me tonight. Before he could answer, she was gone, lost in the sea of mourners. Daniel watched her vanish, a flicker of hope in his chest. The fight for justice was just beginning, and he wouldn't let them bury it along with his son. Daniel's footsteps echoed in the silent halls of the house he and James had once filled with laughter. Now, every room felt like a tomb. In the kitchen, he stared at the empty chair across from him, remembering James's crooked grin as he used to say, "Dad, don't worry. I've got this." He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. The cold air outside rattled the window panes, but inside him burned a quiet, unyielding resolve. He would find the truth, even if it meant tearing apart the very institution his son had trusted with his life. The clock ticked on the wall, the only sound breaking the heavy stillness. Daniel walked to the dining table, where he'd laid out every scrap of evidence he had. The official report lay open, the sterile language of the military clashing with the warmth of James's smile and the framed photo beside it. He picked up the report again, eyes scanning the clinical phrases. Fatal incident during training exercise. No misconduct found. His teeth ground together as he read the same lie for the 100th time. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Meet me tonight. Park by the river. 11 p.m. Come alone. A surge of adrenaline raced through him. He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. He had no idea who it was, but he knew he'd go. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze of memories. James's first day in uniform, the pride in his voice when he called home from basic training. The ache in Daniel's chest deepened with each memory, but it was no longer just grief. It was fuel. As night fell, he grabbed his coat and a flashlight. Before he left, he paused at James's photo, his voice low and firm. Hold on, son. I'm coming for the truth. He stepped out into the cold night, the weight of his determination wrapped around him like armor. The river glowed silver under the moonlight, the water lapping at the edges of the park's stone embankment. Daniel's breath fogged in the chill, each exhale a fleeting ghost. He stood near the water's edge, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Minutes stretched into an eternity before he saw her, the young woman from the memorial, wrapped in a dark coat, her hair pulled back tight. Her face was pale, lips trembling as she approached. Daniel took a step forward, his voice soft but insistent. You said you knew something. Tell me. She hesitated, her eyes darting around as if the darkness itself might betray her. It's not safe, she whispered. They watch everyone. I shouldn't even be here. Daniel's voice hardened. Please. My son is dead. I need to know the truth. Tears welled in her eyes. She looked away, her shoulders shaking. James. He was worried. He said something was wrong with the training exercises. That someone was cutting corners, using live rounds when they weren't supposed to. She swallowed, voice dropping to a shiver. He told me, if anything happened, it wouldn't be an accident. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, the enormity of her words sinking in. Who? Who was behind it? She hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder. Lieutenant Harmon. He was in charge that day. James said he was dangerous, obsessed with real combat scenarios. Her voice cracked. He said they were playing war, but they didn't care if someone got hurt. Daniel's jaw tightened, a surge of cold fury washing over him. Why didn't you come forward sooner? She looked at him, eyes red-rimmed. Because I'm scared, Mr. Reed. And because if I talk, I'm next. Before he could answer, she pressed a small folded paper into his hand. Read this. And be careful. Without another word, she vanished into the shadows, leaving Daniel alone under the silent, watchful moon. Back home, Daniel sat at the kitchen table under the flickering light, the note from the widow clutched in his hand. His pulse thundered in his ears as he unfolded it, the neat handwriting a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. James kept a journal. He hid it in his footlocker at the barracks. It has everything. The words burned into his brain. James's journal, his son's own words, hidden from the world that betrayed him. Daniel felt a mix of relief and dread. If he could find it, he'd have the proof he needed. But if the wrong people knew he was looking... He sat back, staring at the ceiling. Shadows flickered along the cracked paint, like ghosts dancing on the walls. In his mind, he saw James again, that crooked smile, those earnest eyes. Dad, don't worry. I've got this. Daniel whispered back into the silence. I've got this too, son. He called in a favor from an old friend, a retired master sergeant who still had connections on base. The next morning, they met in a dingy coffee shop, the air thick with the scent of burnt beans and old secrets. Daniel, the old sergeant said, his gravelly voice calm but edged with warning. If you go back on base for that journal, you're walking straight into the lion's den. Harmon won't let this go. Daniel leaned in, his voice a low growl. I don't care. My son's truth is in there, and I won't let them bury it. The sergeant studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll get you a pass. One night. In and out. But after that, you're on your own. Daniel's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. One night is all I need. As he walked out into the cold morning air, a strange calm settled over him. He felt the weight of the truth pressing down, but he also felt a flicker of hope. Because now he had a path forward. Now he had a plan. And no matter how deep the darkness, he wouldn't stop until James's voice was heard again. The base was alive with the quiet hum of duty, soldiers moving with purpose, boots striking the concrete in unison. Daniel's borrowed ID pass felt heavy around his neck, each step through those gates a reminder of the weight he carried. He kept his head down, his breath measured, but every glance from a passing soldier made his skin crawl. In the shadows of the armory, he paused, taking in the faded mural of eagles and flags, the patriotic mass that covered the rot beneath. The barracks loomed ahead. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for the door handle, but he forced himself to calm. He stepped inside, the stale air thick with sweat and memories. Rows of bunks lined the narrow space, each one a silent testament to lives shaped by discipline and too often ended by it. He found James's bunk easily. The sheets were gone, stripped bare like a wound left to fester. Daniel knelt beside the footlocker, his fingers brushing the cold metal. He pried it open with shaking hands. Inside, everything was there: James's field manual, a photo of him and his unit grinning in the sun, the battered combat boots that still smelled faintly of earth and sweat. And there, at the bottom, wrapped in an old bandana, was the journal. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He lifted it carefully, the leather cover worn smooth by his son's hands. The first page was filled with neat, confident script. If you're reading this, I guess I didn't make it home. The words hit Daniel like a punch. His vision blurred, but he blinked back the tears. He flipped through the pages, the words growing darker, more urgent. James had written about the drills, how they were pushed past exhaustion, how live ammo was snuck in for realism, how Lieutenant Harmon turned training into a game of Russian roulette. Daniel's hands clenched around the journal. The truth was here, in James's own words. And it was damning. Suddenly, a voice cut through the air behind him. Who the hell are you? Daniel turned slowly, his eyes locking on a young corporal standing in the doorway. The journal hid behind his back, his mind racing. He had the truth in his hands, but now he needed to get out alive. The corporal's eyes narrowed, suspicion etched into every tense line of his face. "I said, who are you?" he repeated, stepping closer. Daniel swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the journal's leather cover, pulse thudding in his ears. "I'm just here to pick up my son's belongings," Daniel lied, his voice calm but laced with steel. The corporal frowned. "I thought all the personal effects were already sent to the family." Daniel forced a bitter smile. "Not everything. There are some things a father needs to see for himself." A flicker of sympathy crossed the corporal's face. He stepped back, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's just orders, you know?" Daniel nodded, swallowing the surge of relief. "I understand. My son, he was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened." The corporal's lips tightened, a shadow flickering in his eyes. He looked around quickly, then lowered his voice. "I didn't know Private Reed personally, but I heard things about that night. Some of us did." Daniel leaned forward, heart racing. "What did you hear?" The corporal hesitated, glancing over his shoulder like he expected Harmon himself to appear. That the drill was off the books. That Harmon was pushing it too far. He wanted real combat readiness at any cost. Some of the guys said they'd seen live rounds in the crates, even though the official line was blanks. Daniel's throat tightened. "And no one stopped him?" The corporal shook his head, shame in his eyes. "Orders are orders, sir. But if what you're doing is to get justice for your son, I hope you find it." He turned and walked away, leaving Daniel alone in the dim barracks. Daniel slipped the journal into his coat, his hands trembling with fury and resolve. As he stepped out into the cold night air, he felt the weight of the journal like a brand against his ribs. James's voice was alive in those pages, and Daniel wouldn't let it be silenced. Back at his kitchen table, Daniel spread the journal out like a map of war. Each page was a revelation, each entry a dagger in the armor of the military's lies. His son's neat handwriting seemed to breathe life into the room, James's voice echoing in every line. "Harmon says this is how we build real soldiers, but it feels like he just wants to play God. Private Jenkins almost got shot today. Harmon laughed it off, said it was good for morale. I'm starting to think this isn't training anymore. It's something else." Daniel read every word, feeling his heart shatter and reforge with each sentence. He saw the fear creeping into James's entries, the transformation from excitement to dread. A knock at the door snapped him out of the trance. He jumped, slamming the journal shut, his pulse racing. "Daniel?" "It's me," came a voice through the door, his friend, the retired sergeant. Daniel let out a breath, unlocking the door and letting the man in. "You got it?" the sergeant asked, his eyes scanning the table. Daniel nodded, pushing the journal across. "It's all here. Everything Harmon did, everything he forced them to do." The sergeant flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. "This is enough to blow the whole damn unit apart. If you go public with this—" "I'm not just going public," Daniel said, his voice low and fierce. "I'm going to make them relive what they did. I'm going to show them, and everyone else, exactly how my son died." The sergeant looked at him, eyes narrowing. "That's a dangerous game, Daniel. You sure you're ready to play it?" Daniel's eyes hardened, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm done playing games. They called it an accident, but I'm going to make sure the whole world knows it was murder." The sergeant nodded, respect glinting in his gaze. "Then let's get to work." Daniel felt the weight of James's journal pressing against his chest as he walked through the base gates one last time. He didn't care about the risk anymore. Each step was a hammer beat in his head. They killed my son. They'll answer for it. Lieutenant Harmon's office was a sterile, gleaming box of polished wood and rank insignia. Daniel's breath fogged the glass of the door as he paused, his reflection staring back, a man who had nothing left to lose. He knocked once, then let himself in. Harmon sat behind the desk, his uniform crisp, every metal perfectly aligned. His eyes flickered up, and a cold smile twisted his lips. "Mr. Reed," he drawled, folding his hands neatly on the desk. "I wasn't expecting you." Daniel shut the door behind him, each click of the lock a drumbeat of finality. He didn't bother sitting. "You know why I'm here," he said evenly, his voice low. "My son." His death wasn't an accident. Harmon's smile widened, though his eyes remained icy. Is that what you've decided? I'm sorry for your loss, of course. But these things happen. War's dangerous, even in training. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. He reached into his coat and slammed the journal on the desk. James wrote about you. About what you did. For a moment, Harmon's expression flickered, a crack in his perfect mask. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow, measured breath. You shouldn't have that, he said quietly. Daniel leaned forward, his knuckles white on the edge of the desk. You're going to pay for what you did. Harmon's smile was gone now, replaced by a cold, reptilian stare. Mr. Reed, he said softly, you're a grieving father. I understand that. But if you try to drag this into the light, you'll find the military doesn't take kindly to interference. Think very carefully about your next move. Daniel met his gaze, unflinching. I already have. He turned and walked out, leaving Harmon's threats to rattle against the steel of his resolve. In that moment, Daniel knew there would be no more silence, no more shadows. He would bring the truth out and damn the consequences. The wind was sharp as a blade as Daniel drove out to the training grounds, the place where James had taken his last breath. The dirt road snaked through the forest like a scar, every bump in the gravel sending shudders through the steering wheel. He pulled up near the perimeter fence, the place eerily deserted this late at night. A single floodlight cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of churned earth and the rusted targets of forgotten drills. Daniel stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin. He walked slowly, each footstep crunching on gravel, the weight of memory pressing down on him. He could almost hear James's laughter in the wind, a phantom echo that pulled at his heart. The spot where his son had died was marked only by a shallow depression in the earth, a wound that the army had tried to smooth over with new dirt and forgetfulness. But the earth never forgets. He knelt, pressing his hand to the ground. I'm here, James, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm here, and I'm going to make this right. The floodlight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to dance in the corners of his vision. In the darkness beyond, he thought he saw movement, a figure standing silent among the trees. Who's there? Daniel called out, his voice steady despite the shiver in his spine. A man stepped into the light, his features familiar. The young corporal from the barracks, his face pale and drawn. I had to come, the corporal said, his voice hushed. I can't stay silent anymore. Daniel rose, his heart hammering. What do you know? The corporal swallowed hard. Harmon. He said it was just training. But we all knew it wasn't. He was obsessed with pushing us further, making us prove ourselves. He said, casualties were just part of the process. His voice cracked. James wasn't the first. He was just the one who wouldn't back down. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. And you? Why are you telling me this? The corporal's eyes were haunted. Because I can't carry it anymore. And because you're the only one who cares. The wind howled around them, and Daniel felt a surge of determination. Then help me, son. Help me make sure they can't hide this anymore. The corporal nodded, a silent promise hanging in the icy air. Daniel's living room became his war room, papers and photos strewn across every surface. The journal lay open on the coffee table, its pages alive with his son's voice. The young corporal had agreed to testify, but that wasn't enough. He needed more. Late into the night, Daniel pieced together every scrap of evidence, training logs, duty rosters, even the corporal's whispered memories. The more he learned, the clearer the picture became. Harmon hadn't just let the accident happen, he'd engineered it. Pushed them past their limits, demanded the impossible. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat beside Daniel, the amber liquid catching the flicker of a lone lamp. He stared at the bottle, then at the photo of James that sat beside it. I can't bring you back, he murmured, voice thick with grief. But I swear, I'll make them pay. A sudden knock at the door startled him, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. He grabbed the journal, tucking it under his arm as he moved to the door. It was the young corporal again, eyes wide with fear. They know, he gasped. Harmon, he knows you're coming for him. Daniel's blood ran cold. How? I saw it in the briefing room, the corporal stammered. He's already covering his tracks. Files are vanishing. People are being moved out of the unit. He's scared. He's dangerous, Mr. Reed. You can't let him shut you up. Daniel's jaw set, his mind racing. Then we move faster. We hit him where he can't hide, in front of everyone. No shadows. No cover-ups. The corporal nodded shakily. What do you need me to do? Daniel's eyes burned with purpose. Help me recreate the drill. Exactly how it happened. Let the whole world see what he did to my son. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like hope, sharp and electric in his veins. The truth was his weapon now, and he would wield it without mercy. The night was thick with mist as Daniel stood in the darkened alley behind the barracks, the corporal at his side. Rain drummed steadily on the cracked pavement, each drop adding to the weight in his chest. The corporal's breath steamed in the cold, his voice a shaky whisper. They're already rewriting the reports. You'll never find a paper trail now. It's all disappearing. Daniel's jaw clenched. Then we won't rely on their words. We'll show them. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small voice recorder, its red light blinking faintly in the gloom. Everything you know, he said. Every order, every corner they cut. I want it on record. The corporal swallowed, nodding. Okay. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and began. We were ordered to run live fire drills, but none of us signed off on it. Harmon said it was combat conditioning, said we needed to be ready for the real thing. But it wasn't training. It was reckless. It was murder. The words poured out, raw and desperate. Daniel listened, his heart breaking with each detail, the fear in their eyes, the commands barked with no regard for safety, the cold indifference when James lay bleeding in the dirt. James tried to stop it. The corporal said finally, his voice trembling. He went to Harmon. He said it was wrong. And the next drill, that's when he didn't come back. Daniel pressed a hand to the young man's shoulder. You're doing the right thing, he said quietly. This is bigger than either of us now. The corporal looked at him, haunted. What if they come for me? They won't, Daniel said, his voice firm. Because I'll make sure the world knows before they can bury this too. In the rain-soaked darkness, Daniel felt the first crack of light breaking through. The truth was no longer just a secret. It was a weapon he would wield for his son. Back in his cramped living room, Daniel set the voice recorder on the table, its blinking red light a silent promise. He stared at it for a long moment, then turned to the battered laptop in front of him. The journal was open beside it, each page a testament to the nightmare James had lived. He pulled up the video file the corporal had given him, shaky footage shot from a soldier's helmet cam. Daniel's hand hovered over the play button, his stomach twisting with dread. When he finally clicked it, the screen flickered to life with the muffled thud of boots on dirt. A harsh voice, Harmon's voice, barked orders over the roar of gunfire. Daniel's breath caught. He could see it all, the confusion, the fear, the deadly precision of a drill that had become a trap. Push forward. Don't stop. Harmon's voice snarled through the static. The camera jolted as soldiers ducked behind cover. Then the unmistakable crack of live rounds tearing through the air. Daniel's hands shook. He forced himself to watch, every frame searing into his memory. In the chaos, he caught a glimpse of James, just a flash of his profile, his jaw set, eyes wide with disbelief. Cease fire. Cease fire. James's voice rang out, clear even in the crackle of gunfire. But no one listened. A sharp, sudden shot. The camera jolted again, then James's voice cut off. Daniel paused the video, his breath ragged. He pressed his forehead to the edge of the table, tears burning his eyes. I'm so sorry, son, he whispered. But grief was no longer enough. He copied the footage to 3 separate drives, each one a lifeline of truth he wouldn't let slip away. He emailed one to his lawyer, another to the retired sergeant. He couldn't trust the system, but he could trust the evidence. And he could trust the power of a father who refused to let his son's voice die in the static. Morning light crept through the blinds, pale and uncertain. Daniel sat at the table, exhaustion weighing him down, but his mind was sharp, coiled tight with purpose. He knew Harmon would be watching, that the walls were closing in. But to finish this, he had to play the part one last time. He dressed carefully, pulling on a worn jacket and smoothing his hair in the cracked mirror. He practiced his smile, tight-lipped, hollow, convincing enough to hide the storm underneath. When he arrived at the base's visitor center, he was greeted with polite nods and measured words. "Mr. Reed," a clerk said, her smile professional. "You're here for the final release of your son's effects?" "Yes," Daniel lied smoothly, his voice calm. "I just want closure." Inside, every corridor hummed with forced normalcy, soldiers laughing too loudly, boots tapping out rhythms that felt like warning drums. Daniel kept his eyes forward, his pace steady. He felt the weight of every secret he carried like a shield around his heart. He made his way to the storage room, where James's personal effects were boxed up, the air stale with old paper and half-forgotten memories. He signed the papers with a steady hand, but inside, his pulse raced. A young officer stood nearby, his posture too rigid, eyes flicking nervously. Daniel forced a polite smile. "Thank you," he said softly. The young man's lips twitched, a ghost of regret in his eyes. I'm sorry for your loss, sir." Daniel held his gaze, searching for any crack in the facade. "Thank you," he said again, but his mind was already elsewhere, focused on the next step. He left the base with the box in his arms, but it was the flash drive in his pocket, and the journal hidden inside his jacket, that truly mattered. As he drove away, the sun broke through the clouds, a fleeting shaft of light cutting through the gray. In that moment, Daniel allowed himself a flicker of hope. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniel sat alone in the living room, the only light coming from the flickering TV in the corner, but he wasn't watching it. His eyes were fixed on the small voice recorder in his hand, the last message from James he'd never heard until now. His thumb hesitated on the play button, breath caught in his throat. Then he pressed it. "Hey, Dad. Just wanted to let you know. I've got a bad feeling about this next drill. Lieutenant Harmon's pushing us hard, too hard. It doesn't feel like training anymore." James's voice was steady but tight, the calm of a soldier, the worry of a son. Daniel's eyes burned. "If something happens, don't believe them. Don't let them tell you it was an accident. Promise me that, Dad. Promise me." The recording clicked off. The room was silent except for Daniel's ragged breathing. He gripped the recorder like it was the last piece of his boy he had left. The phone buzzed on the table, pulling him back to the present. The retired sergeant's voice crackled through the speaker. "We're ready," he said. "The Veterans Day ceremony. We'll have the footage queued up. All you need to do is give the word." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that choice. He thought of James's voice, that quiet plea for the truth to be known. "I'll be there," Daniel said, "and I'll make sure they hear him." He ended the call, feeling a cold calm settle over him. This wasn't just for James anymore. It was for every son and daughter they tried to bury with their lies. He stood up, the weight of grief and purpose making his shoulders square. He wouldn't be the broken father anymore. He would be the voice his son had lost. Veterans Day dawned crisp and bright, the sky an endless blue that felt almost mocking in its beauty. Daniel stood near the rows of white chairs set up on the memorial field, his breath clouding in the cold morning air. Families gathered, soldiers in dress blues milling around, the quiet murmur of voices blending with the mournful brass of the band warming up. Everywhere he looked, there were smiles and handshakes, the comforting lies of ceremony. And at the center of it all stood Lieutenant Harmon, his uniform immaculate, medals shining in the sun. His eyes met Daniel's across the crowd, and for a moment, the world went still. Harmon's smile was polite, but it never reached his eyes. He walked over, his boots crunching on the frost-laced grass. "Mr. Reed," he said smoothly, extending his hand. "Glad to see you here today." Daniel looked at the outstretched hand, then back at Harmon's face. Slowly, he shook his head. "I didn't come here to shake hands," he said quietly. Harmon's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "You're making a mistake, Daniel. This is a day for honor, not for your accusations." Daniel's voice was calm, every word like a blade. "No, this is a day for the truth. My son died for it, and I'm not going to let you bury that too." A flicker of anger passed across Harmon's face, quickly replaced by that practiced, icy calm. Be careful, he said softly. There are consequences for pushing too hard. Daniel's jaw tightened. I'm counting on it. As Harmon turned and walked back to the podium, Daniel felt the final pieces lock into place. The cameras were ready. The footage was queued up. And the world was about to see the truth. The ceremony began with somber music, the crowd rising as a color guard marched slowly across the field. Daniel stood off to the side, his eyes locked on Harmon's rigid form at the podium. Harmon spoke in solemn tones about sacrifice and duty, his voice rich with practiced sincerity. But to Daniel, it sounded like ash, the empty words of a man who had never known the weight of real loss. He scanned the crowd, searching for allies in the sea of polite faces. He saw the young corporal near the edge, his eyes wide and nervous. And farther back, the retired sergeant stood with arms crossed, his gaze steady and fierce. The moment the speech ended, Daniel stepped forward. The murmur of the crowd shifted as he approached the microphone. He felt every eye on him, but his mind was clear. My name is Daniel Reed, he began, his voice calm but ringing with a quiet strength. My son, Private James Reed, died in what they called a training accident. But the truth is, it wasn't an accident at all. A ripple went through the crowd, whispers rising like a wave. Harmon's face hardened, his posture rigid. Daniel reached into his coat, pulling out the small voice recorder. He held it up, his voice unwavering. This is my son's voice. His last words. And you're all going to hear them today. He pressed play. James's voice spilled into the air, steady and clear. It doesn't feel like training anymore. If something happens, don't let them call it an accident. Gasps echoed through the gathering. Daniel's heart pounded, but he pressed on. There's more, he said, his voice fierce. The footage. The orders. Everything Harmon tried to hide. The retired sergeant stepped forward, lifting a small remote. A giant screen flickered to life behind the podium, the helmet cam footage filling the crisp autumn air with the raw sounds of the drill, the chaos, the fear, the truth. The world stopped for a breath, and then it started to unravel. The crowd at the memorial fell into a stunned, uneasy silence as the footage played on the massive screen. Cries of panic echoed in the air, real, not staged, soldiers ducking under live rounds that should never have been there. The crackle of Harmon's voice barking commands felt like a slap across the field. Daniel watched Harmon's face as the footage rolled, watched the commander's jaw tighten, his lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, the cold mask cracked. Mothers in the audience covered their mouths, eyes wide with horror. An older veteran shook his head slowly, the tremor in his hands unmistakable. The truth was there for everyone to see, no spin, no cover-up, no half-truths wrapped in official language. When the video ended, Daniel stepped back to the microphone, his voice calm and measured. My son was not the only one. This was not an isolated mistake. This was a pattern, one they tried to bury. A woman in the front row wept openly, clutching a folded flag to her chest. Daniel's eyes burned, but he forced the words out. James trusted the people in charge of him, and they used that trust like a weapon. My son deserved better, and so did every other soldier they treated like cannon fodder. Harmon's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and brittle. This is a memorial service, not a courtroom, he snapped, his face red with fury. You have no right to. Daniel turned to him slowly, his voice low and lethal. I have every right, he said. I have the right to my son's truth. And I have the right to make sure no one forgets what you did. The retired sergeant stepped forward, his voice grave. The footage has been sent to the Military Review Board. And to the press, he said. You can't bury this, Lieutenant. The world knows now. Harmon's eyes flicked around wildly, searching for some kind of escape. But there was none. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Daniel felt the rage burning in his chest like wildfire. He looked out over the crowd, their shocked, tear-streaked faces reflecting his own pain. For years, he had lived with a hollow ache, trying to be the calm voice, the grieving father who accepted the Army's lies because he had no choice. But that man was gone now. I want you all to hear this, he said, his voice carrying over the cold autumn air. My son's death was not an accident. It was the direct result of negligence and a commander who treated lives like disposable assets. He lifted the journal, the worn leather cover catching the light. James wrote about the drills, about how he begged for them to stop. But no one listened. Harmon stepped forward, his composure cracking. "This is a tragedy, but you're turning it into a circus," he hissed. "You're shaming the uniform." Daniel met his gaze, unflinching. "The uniform is not the problem," he said. "You are. You took the honor of these men and twisted it to serve your ego. That's not patriotism. That's betrayal." The crowd was silent, every eye on them. Daniel could feel the weight of their disbelief, their heartbreak, but he could also feel the shift. The seed of doubt Harmon had tried so hard to bury was now a wildfire of outrage. A soldier in the back of the crowd called out, his voice shaking. "Sir, is it true? Did he really order live rounds?" Daniel turned to him, his expression softening. "It's all in here," he said, lifting the journal. "Every order, every mistake they called training." James wrote it down because he knew they'd try to hide it. The young soldier's shoulders slumped, his eyes shining with tears. Then he died for nothing? "No," Daniel said fiercely, stepping forward. "He died for the truth. And today, that truth is finally free." The ceremony broke into chaos as Daniel's words sank in. Families surged forward, demanding answers, while others turned away, their faces pale with shock. Harmon tried to regain control, barking orders to the soldiers who stood rigid and silent. But the weight of the truth was too heavy to deny. The retired sergeant pulled Daniel aside, his voice urgent. "You've done what you came here to do," he said. "But Harmon won't let this stand. He'll push back, hard. You need to be ready for that." Daniel looked at him, his eyes clear and hard. "I'm not afraid of him," he said. "I'm not afraid of any of them anymore." The sergeant's gaze softened. "I know," he said quietly. "But remember, the system protects itself. This isn't over just because the footage is out there. Harmon's going to fight like hell to hold on to his power. And the people who helped him, they'll turn on you if they have to." Daniel nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle in his bones. "Then let them," he said. "I'll face them all if I have to. I'm not going to stop until my son's name is cleared." The sergeant gripped his shoulder. "Good," he said. "But watch your back. They won't come at you in the open. They'll come in the dark. Be ready." Daniel nodded again, his jaw set. He turned back to the crowd, the voices of mothers and fathers rising in grief and fury. And through it all, he felt something inside him settle, not peace, not yet, but a kind of steel. This was no longer just about James. It was about every soldier who'd ever been silenced, every family who'd been told to accept the lies. Daniel Reed had nothing left to lose, and he would not stop, not until justice was done. The cold November wind bit at Daniel's face as he stood on the edge of the crowd, his breath rising in pale clouds. The ceremony was over, the chairs already half empty, but the echoes of what he'd revealed still crackled in the air like static. People were talking in hushed voices, turning to look at him with wide eyes and furrowed brows. As the last of the families trickled away, the young corporal found him again. His face was pale, eyes wide with the enormity of what they'd just done. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What happens now? They're going to come after you. They'll come after all of us." Daniel placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, gripping it with a steady strength. "I know," he said, "but they can't silence us all, not anymore. And you're not alone in this." He looked past the corporal, catching the eye of the retired sergeant who stood at the edge of the field, arms crossed, a silent sentinel. Daniel nodded to him, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared now. That night, back in his home, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the sergeant and the corporal. The journal lay open between them, the flickering lamp casting long shadows across the worn pages. "We're going to finish this," Daniel said quietly. "We're going to recreate the drill, every step, every order. We're going to show the world exactly how it happened and exactly how James died." The corporal swallowed hard, but he nodded. "I'll help. I remember every detail, every second of it." The sergeant leaned forward, his voice a low growl. and I'll handle the logistics. The cameras. The broadcast. If Harmon thought today was bad, he has no idea what's coming. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what they were about to do settle over him like a mantle. But in that weight, there was something else too, a flicker of fierce pride. For James, he said. For every son and daughter they tried to silence. And in the cold, silent night, they began to plan. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Daniel moved through them like a man possessed, each breath a step closer to the truth he refused to let die. He met with the corporal in secret places, parking garages, shadowed alleys, every meeting a risk, every conversation another piece of the puzzle. They mapped out the field, the drills, every movement, every misstep that had turned it from training to slaughter. The corporal's voice was low, his eyes hollow as he recounted it all. The orders barked in the dark, the confusion and fear that had gripped them all. James tried to stop it, he said, his voice breaking. He stood up and shouted for them to cease fire. But Harmon, he wouldn't hear it. Daniel wrote it all down, his hand steady even as his heart thundered in his chest. He saw it in his mind's eye, the chaos, the noise, the final shot that had stolen his son's life. In the quiet hours of the night, he sat at his kitchen table, James's photograph propped against the salt shaker. He traced the lines of his son's face with his finger, his voice a whisper. "I'm so sorry, James," he said. "I didn't see it then, but I see it now, and I won't let them forget." The retired sergeant worked tirelessly beside him, his calm presence a rock against the storm. He brought in cameras, scouted locations, coordinated with the few allies they had left. "This isn't just for you," he said quietly one night, his eyes meeting Daniel's. "It's for every soldier they've ever lied about. Every family they tried to bury under red tape and half-truths." Daniel nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on his shoulders, but he welcomed it. Because this was the only weight that mattered, the truth. The day of the reenactment dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Daniel stood at the edge of the training ground, the same dirt field that had stolen his son's life. His breath fogged in the chill, but his eyes were clear and hard. The cameras were set up, small, unassuming lenses hidden in the brush and the trees. The retired sergeant gave him a thumbs up from the edge of the field, his expression grim but resolute. "We're living 5, he said. "Once it starts, there's no going back." Daniel nodded. "That's the point." The young corporal stood nearby, dressed in the same fatigues he'd worn on that day. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady as he turned to Daniel. "I remember everything," he said. "I'll show them exactly how it happened." Daniel clapped a hand on his shoulder, his voice soft. "Thank you. I know this isn't easy. It's the right thing," the corporal said. "For James. For all of us." As the cameras blinked to life, Daniel stepped onto the field, feeling the earth cold and unyielding beneath his boots. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw James's face. The laughter, the light in his eyes. The way he'd said, "I've got this, Dad." Daniel took a breath and opened his eyes. "Let's begin," he said quietly. The corporal moved into position, his voice low and tight as he began to call out the movements, the same steps they'd taken on that nightmarish day. The same commands Harmon had barked, but this time, every word was a confession. As the cameras rolled, Daniel felt the ghost of the past stirring around him. But he wasn't afraid. This time, the world would see the truth, and no one would be able to turn away. As the reenactment unfolded, the cameras captured every detail, the haunted eyes of the corporal as he retraced his steps, the echo of shouted commands, and the crackle of the radio. Daniel stood off to the side, his arms crossed, every muscle in his body wound tight. The retired sergeant watched the feeds from a small monitor set up under a camouflage tarp. "It's all coming through," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Crystal clear." Daniel didn't take his eyes off the field. "Good. They need to see this. Every second of it." The young corporal moved like a ghost in the dirt, his voice shaking but steady. "We took our positions here. They told us to expect blanks, but the rounds were real." His breath caught, a tremor running through his shoulders. "Private Reed, James," he knew it was wrong. He tried to stop it. Daniel's heart ached at the sound of his son's name spoken aloud, but he forced himself to stay present. The truth was here, bleeding out in every word the corporal spoke. The retired sergeant's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. "We're already getting hits," he said. "Reporters. Military families. They're watching." Daniel's breath quickened. He knew the risk, but he also knew the power of the truth laid bare. "Keep it live," he said, his voice hard. "They need to see this. They need to understand what really happened." The corporal stopped, his shoulders slumping as he pointed to a marker on the field, the exact spot where James had fallen. "This is where he died," he said, his voice breaking. And no one tried to help. They just kept going, like he was nothing. The weight of those words hung in the cold air, heavy and unforgiving. Daniel stepped forward, his eyes burning. "He was everything," he said quietly. "And today, the world is going to remember him." Far from the quiet field, Harmon watched the broadcast from a darkened office, his face pale and tight, with barely contained fury. The footage was clear, undeniable. The live rounds, the chaos, the way James had shouted for a ceasefire only to be ignored. His hand clenched around the edge of his desk, knuckles white. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered. He was supposed to stay silent. A junior officer hovered nervously by the door. "Sir, what do we do?" "It's everywhere. The footage, the journal, it's all out there now." Harmon turned on him like a snake striking, his voice a venomous hiss. "You listen to me. You say nothing. You do nothing. This will blow over. It always does." The officer swallowed, his eyes darting to the monitor. "But, sir, the families, they're demanding answers." "The media, I said it will blow over," Harmon snapped. "We control the narrative. We always have." But as he spoke, doubt flickered in his eyes. Because this time, the narrative wasn't his. It was Daniel Reed's, and it was the voice of a father who had nothing left to lose. He sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of the footage and the fury of the families pressing in around him like a noose. He thought of the medals on his chest, the speeches he'd given about honor and sacrifice. He thought of the lie he built so carefully, now crumbling under the weight of a single, unbreakable truth. Harmon's hand trembled as he reached for the phone. His voice was cold and flat as he spoke into the receiver. "Get me legal counsel," he said. "Now." But in his gut, he already knew there was no counsel that could bury this. The truth was out, and the world was watching. Back at the field, the reenactment had ended, the air heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. Daniel stood with the retired sergeant and the corporal, the three of them silent as the last camera flickered off. The young corporal looked pale and exhausted, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. "I thought I'd be scared," he said quietly, "but it feels like a weight's been lifted." Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "That's what the truth does," he said. "It frees you." The retired sergeant nodded, his eyes sweeping the field one last time. "They can't spin this," he said. "It's too clear, too raw. They'll try, but it won't stick." Daniel's gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to break through the gray clouds. A thin beam of light cut across the dirt, a brief glimmer of something like hope. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. They'll fight back, but we're ready for that." The corporal looked at him, his expression serious. "What about you?" he asked. "They're going to come for you harder than anyone. You know that, right?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but there was no fear in his eyes. "Let them," he said. "I've already lost everything. They can't take anything else from me." He looked down at the journal in his hand, the worn cover a testament to the voice of a son who refused to be forgotten. In that battered book was the heart of this battle, and the promise that no matter how hard they tried, they could never silence the truth again. As they left the field together, the wind picked up, rustling the dry grass like a chorus of whispers. And in that quiet, Daniel heard his son's voice, steady and strong. "I've got this, Dad." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, a quiet smile on his lips. "We've got this," he whispered. The night air was crisp and biting as Daniel drove away from the training grounds, headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. The corporal's testimony echoed in his head, every word a testament to the horror that had stolen his son's life. He pulled over by the river, the water glinting under the sliver of moonlight. Sitting behind the wheel, he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The faces of every family he'd seen at the memorial played through his mind, mothers clutching folded flags, fathers staring into nothing, their grief a silent scream. Daniel let the tears come this time, hot and silent on his cheeks. He didn't try to wipe them away. Grief had shaped him, honed him, but it would not break him. Not now. He pulled out the journal, flipping through the pages with a reverence that felt like prayer. James's words flowed like a river, the drills, the fear, the final plea for someone, anyone, to listen. Daniel spoke into the empty car, his voice low and sure. "I hear you, son. I hear you." The phone buzzed in his pocket, the retired sergeant's voice crackling through the line. "It's everywhere now, Daniel. News outlets, veterans groups, they're demanding an investigation." Daniel closed his eyes, relief and exhaustion washing over him. "Good," he said. "They need to see what I've seen." The sergeant's voice was quiet but firm. "You did what you set out to do. But this isn't over. You're in their crosshairs now. You ready for that?" Daniel looked out at the river, the moonlight shimmering like a promise. "I've been ready since the day they told me my son was dead," he said softly. "Let them come. I'm not backing down." In the stillness, the river's gentle current carried away the last of his doubts. Tomorrow would be a war, but tonight, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, justice had finally found its voice. As dawn broke the next morning, Daniel was already up, pacing the small living room of his house. The young corporal arrived, his uniform wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes. "They're calling us in," he said, voice hushed and urgent. "They want statements. They're saying this is all lies, that we're part of some conspiracy." Daniel's jaw clenched. "They're trying to bury it again. They think if they throw enough doubt, enough confusion, they can shut it down before it takes root." The corporal ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. I thought once the footage was out there, it would be enough." Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but steely. "The footage was the beginning. But they're scared now, and that's when they're the most dangerous. They'll try to turn this on us, twist it until we're the villains." The corporal swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping. "What if they make it stick? What if they ruin us for this?" Daniel reached out, gripping the young man's shoulder. "Then we fight harder. We stay in the light, where they can't twist the story. We keep telling the truth again and again, until no one can ignore it." He thought of Harmon, the cold calculation in the commander's eyes, of the families who still didn't know the truth about how their sons had died. Rage flickered through him, sharp and focused. "We're not the ones who should be afraid," he said. "They are. Because the truth is a blade they can't dull, and we're going to wield it until they fall." The corporal nodded, a flicker of determination in his gaze. "Then let's finish it," he said. Daniel smiled, grim and sure. "Let's finish it." The day was gray and bitterly cold as Daniel met with the retired sergeant in a small diner on the outskirts of town. The smell of burnt coffee and stale eggs filled the air, but they paid it no mind. Their voices were low, their heads bent close together over a battered folder of documents. "These are the after-action reports from the last few years," the sergeant said, his finger tapping the stack. "Dozens of accidents. Same unit. Same commander." Daniel's eyes scanned the pages, the cold, clinical language of bureaucracy doing nothing to hide the pattern beneath. "This was never about training," he said quietly. "It was about control, about pushing them past breaking, no matter the cost." The sergeant nodded, his face grim. "I've seen this before. Commanders who think they're above the rules." But Harmon, he took it further, and no one stopped him. Daniel's hands tightened around the file, his voice steady. "No one until now." The sergeant leaned back, his eyes searching Daniel's face. "You know what's coming next, don't you?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Harmon will try to make this go away. He'll use every bit of power he has, and the army will back him, if they think it'll protect their image." "Then what do we do?" the sergeant asked. Daniel met his gaze, his eyes clear and unwavering. "We go public. Wider than we have so far. We show them not just the footage, but the pattern. The deaths they called accidents until the truth broke through. The sergeant's lips curved into a thin smile. Then we'd better get ready, he said. Because once we do that, there's no turning back. Daniel looked down at the folder in his hands, the final piece of the puzzle. He thought of James, of the laughter they'd shared, the dreams that had died with a single gunshot. No more lies. No more hiding. He stood, his voice firm. Then let's make sure they can't turn away. Let's make sure they see the ghosts they tried so hard to bury. The next morning, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the folder of after-action reports spread out like a map of ghosts. The paper smelled of dust and old secrets, the inked words dancing like accusations under the dim light. He traced the lines of each report with a finger, feeling the weight of them pressed down on his chest. The language was cold and clinical: training incident, unexpected discharge, fatal mishap. But beneath the sterile words, he could hear the echoes of every shot fired, every breath stolen. The retired sergeant sat across from him, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. "These aren't just numbers," he said quietly. "These are sons, fathers, brothers." And they thought no one would ever see them. Daniel's jaw tightened. They thought wrong. His phone buzzed with a message. The corporal, checking in. "They're asking questions. I'm trying to stay quiet, but I don't know how long I can keep them off me." Daniel typed back quickly, his fingers shaking. "Hold the line. We're almost there." He turned to the sergeant, his voice low. "We need to connect these reports to Harmon. Show that every time someone died, he was there." And he signed off. The sergeant nodded, his eyes sharp. "I'll handle that. But you need to be ready for when he comes for you. Because he will." Daniel closed his eyes, drawing in a slow breath. "Let him come," he said. "I'm not afraid of him anymore." He opened his laptop, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat on the screen. He began typing, not just the reports, but the story. James's story. The truth, raw and undeniable, that no one would ever be able to bury again. As he wrote, he felt something shift deep in his chest. Grief was still there, it always would be. But now it had a purpose, and nothing Harmon did would stop it from seeing the light. The following night, the air was thick with the chill of winter as Daniel met the retired sergeant in a deserted warehouse on the edge of town. The single bulb overhead cast long, jagged shadows across the concrete floor, turning the stacks of crates into silent sentinels. The sergeant had brought someone new, a woman with sharp eyes and a quiet confidence that crackled in the cold air. She introduced herself as Kate, an investigative journalist who'd been chasing military corruption for years. Daniel sized her up, his voice careful. "You're not military. Why are you here?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Because I've seen this before. Different names, same lies. And because someone needs to make sure the world knows what Harmon did and what the system let him do." The sergeant leaned forward, his voice low. "She's good, Daniel. And she's got contacts who can't be bought or bullied." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But this doesn't leave our circle until it's ready. I won't risk another cover-up." Kate's expression softened just a fraction. "I get it. But you're going to need someone who can put this in front of the right people. You've got the footage, the reports. I can build the case around them. Make sure the story is told." Daniel looked down at the journal in his hands, the battered leather worn smooth by grief and resolve. "It's more than a story," he said. "It's my son's life. It's every soldier they tried to break." Kate nodded. "Then let's make sure it has an ending that means something." They spent the next hours hunched over the files and footage, weaving together the threads of the story, a tapestry of betrayal and silence, of voices finally raised. And in that cold, echoing warehouse, Daniel felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't dared hope for in months. A chance at justice. 2 days later, Daniel stood in the living room of his small house, the battered walls closing in around him like a cocoon. Maps and diagrams covered the coffee table, every inch of space a testament to the plan taking shape. The corporal sat across from him, his hands fidgeting with a pen. "I can walk them through it, step by step," he said. "Show exactly how Harmon set it up. But what if they say I'm lying? What if they say I'm just trying to cover my own ass?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm and firm. "Then we show them the footage. We show them the reports. And we show them your courage." The young man looked up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were scared, but there was a spark there too, a glimmer of defiance. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." The retired sergeant checked his watch. "We've got one shot at this. Harmon will be at the ceremony, but he won't see it coming." Daniel's lips curved in a thin smile. "Good. Let him stand there in front of everyone and watch as his lies come apart." He looked around the room, at the photos of James that lined the walls, the quiet echoes of a life that had ended far too soon. He thought of his son's laughter, the way he'd said, "I've got this, Dad," with a grin that lit up his whole face. Daniel's voice dropped to a murmur. "We're almost there, James," he said. "Almost there." The corporal shifted, his voice low. "Mr. Reed, do you ever wonder what James would think of all this?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I think he'd be proud," he said, "because this isn't just for him anymore. It's for every soldier who deserved better." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like a drumbeat of resolve. Inside, they prepared for the final drill, the final stand. The truth was waiting to be set free. The morning of the Veterans Day ceremony arrived with a pale winter sun that did nothing to warm the chill in the air. Daniel woke early, the weight of what was to come pressing down on his chest like a stone. But there was no fear in him now, only purpose. He dressed in a dark suit, the same one he'd worn to James's funeral. He straightened his tie in the cracked mirror, the reflection staring back at him calm and resolute. "For you, James," he murmured. "For every one of them." The drive to the memorial was silent, the fields rolling by in shades of brown and frost. The retired sergeant was waiting when he arrived, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat. "Everything's set," he said. "The cameras, the feeds, they'll see it all." Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Good. Today, the world stops pretending." As they walked to the ceremony grounds, families gathered in small clusters, mothers in black coats, fathers holding photos of sons lost to war. There was a quiet murmur in the air, a sense of waiting. The corporal joined them, his uniform neat, but his eyes shadowed with nerves. "I'm ready," he said, his voice low. "I'll tell them everything." Daniel clapped a hand on his shoulder, the weight of that simple gesture a promise. "You're not alone," he said. "Not today. Not ever." The wind cut through the crowd, carrying the faint sound of a trumpet warming up. Harmon stood near the podium, his face calm but his eyes darting, searching. Daniel met that gaze and held it, unblinking. The final pieces were in place. The stage was set, and in the cold morning light, Daniel felt the ghosts of every soldier who'd been silenced gathering behind him, their voices ready to rise, their stories ready to be heard. He took a slow breath, his shoulders squaring. The calm before the storm. The calm before the confrontation that would change everything. As the families gathered at the Veterans Day ceremony, the gentle ripple of conversations and rustling coats felt almost unreal, a quiet before the reckoning. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, his breath misting in the cold air, eyes locked on the podium where Harmon adjusted his notes with practiced ease. The retired sergeant moved through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent his life in war zones. He tapped Daniel's shoulder and nodded, voice low. "We're live. Everything's rolling. Once you give the word, there's no taking it back." Daniel inhaled deeply, feeling the pulse of determination steady and strong beneath his ribs. "Good," he said. "It's time." As Harmon stepped forward to speak, Daniel felt the weight of every family's grief pressing in around them, the weight of every lie and every stolen breath. Harmon's voice boomed over the microphone, calm and self-assured. "We gather today to honor the memory of those who gave their lives for freedom." Daniel stepped closer to the stage, the journal clutched in his hands. He felt the tremor in his fingers, the hot surge of fury behind his ribs. No more silence. No more polite lies. When Harmon paused for breath, Daniel raised his hand. His voice cut through the cold morning air, steady and clear. "Tell them the truth, Harmon," he said. "Tell them how my son really died." Gasps rose from the crowd. Harmon froze, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Reed, this is not the time. It's exactly the time, Daniel interrupted. His voice rang with a power that could not be denied. The family's here. They deserve to know what happened. They deserve to know the truth you tried to bury. The silence that followed was heavy as iron. And in that silence, Daniel saw the first flicker of fear in Harmon's eyes, a crack in the armor he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. Harmon's face went rigid, the polished commander's mask slipping as he gripped the edges of the podium. His voice dropped to a low, cold growl. Mr. Reed, I'm warning you, this is not the place. But Daniel didn't waver. He stepped forward, the journal held high. You warned my son, too, and look where it got him. His voice trembled with grief, but there was steel beneath it, unyielding. You want to keep this buried? Then stand there and deny it. Deny the footage. Deny the words in this journal. Harmon's jaw worked as he struggled for words, the calm slipping away. This is slander, he hissed, his voice tight with desperation. You're tarnishing the memory of every soldier who ever. I'm giving them their dignity back. Daniel shot back. His breath fogged in the cold, his face flushed with a righteous fury. I'm giving them the truth. The families in the crowd shifted, their eyes wide, some brimming with tears. A young woman clutched a dog tag to her chest, her lips parted in a silent prayer. In the back, a man in a battered army jacket crossed his arms, his eyes locked on Harmon with a grim, knowing stare. The retired sergeant moved beside Daniel, his voice calm but deadly. The cameras are on you, Harmon. Every word you say, the world is watching. Harmon's face flushed an ugly red. This is a private matter, he snapped, but his voice had lost its command. This is not, it's a matter of lives, Daniel cut in, his voice rising. Of trust. Of every parent who sent their child into your hands and believed they'd come home safe. Harmon's shoulders sagged for the briefest second. And in that instant, Daniel knew the truth was already tearing him apart from the inside. At the edge of the field, the retired sergeant gave a subtle nod to Kate, who stood at the control console under a tarp. Her fingers danced over the controls, and the giant screen flickered to life, first static, then the footage. Soldiers running, the confusion and chaos, Harmon's voice barking orders with reckless abandon. Gasps tore through the crowd as the footage played. Mothers clutched each other's hands. A father dropped to his knees, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. Harmon's face blanched, the last of his composure stripped away by the brutal honesty of the images. Daniel stepped forward, his voice clear and strong. This is what they called training. This is what they called acceptable risk. This is the truth, not the sanitized lies they fed us. The young corporal moved up beside him, his voice shaking but resolute. I was there. I saw it. I lived it. Private Reed, he died because of that man's arrogance, because he thought he could play God. The retired sergeant's voice carried over the quiet sobs of the crowd. And now you all see it. The truth you were never meant to hear. No more excuses. No more cover-ups. Harmon's lips moved soundlessly as he watched the footage, his eyes flickering with something like terror. He reached for the microphone, his voice a cracked whisper. This is out of context, but the crowd was already turning on him. Voices rose, sharp and urgent. How many died like this? How many more accidents, Commander? Tell the truth. Daniel locked eyes with Harmon, his own voice low and deadly. This isn't out of context. This is the world finally seeing what you try to hide. The tension in the air was electric as Harmon's face went pale under the scrutiny of the crowd. He looked around, searching for an ally, but the soldiers who had once stood stiffly at attention now shifted uneasily, their eyes downcast. One by one, they began to move. A sergeant stepped forward, his voice rough. Sir, it's true. We were ordered to run those drills with live rounds. We tried to stop it, but you wouldn't listen. Harmon's lips parted, but no words came. His shoulders slumped as another young soldier stepped up, voice tight with anger. James Reed didn't have to die. None of them did. And you let it happen. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Harmon's hands trembled on the podium, his eyes darting wildly. You're all traitors, he spat, but his voice was weak now, cracking under the weight of their defiance. Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped forward, the journal still clutched in his hand like a shield. "They're not traitors," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "They're soldiers, and they're done carrying your lies." The young corporal lifted his head, his eyes clear for the first time. "We're done being afraid," he said. "You don't own us anymore." For a moment, everything was still, the cold air holding its breath, the sun breaking through the clouds to cast a hard, honest light on Harmon's face. And then the crowd erupted, voices raised not in anger, but in something fiercer, a demand for truth. As Harmon shrank back from the podium, Daniel felt a fierce, quiet triumph settle in his chest. The facade had cracked. The silence was broken. And now, at last, the world could hear the voices they'd tried so hard to bury. As the crowd's outrage swelled, Daniel felt a hush fall inside his chest, a quiet clarity that steadied his breath even as his heart pounded. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "My name is Daniel Reed," he said, his eyes sweeping over every tear-streaked face, every trembling lip. "I'm just a father who trusted the system to protect his son. And that trust killed him." He held up the journal, his hands firm. "This is my son's voice. James Reed." He wrote it all down. Every order, every moment of fear, every time they were pushed too far. His voice wavered for a heartbeat, but he didn't let it break. "I spent months listening to their excuses, their lies. And every night, I heard my son's voice in the dark, begging me not to let them silence him." The young corporal stepped beside him, his face pale but his eyes fierce. "We all heard that voice," he said. "We all knew, and now the world does too." Daniel looked at Harmon, who stood frozen at the podium, his lips parted, a broken man in the bright, unforgiving light. "You thought you could hide behind your rank, behind your medals. But you forgot that the truth doesn't care about your titles." For a moment, the wind was the only sound, cold and biting across the memorial field. Then a mother's sob broke the silence, sharp, raw, a sound that carried every wound in the world. Daniel's chest tightened, but he held his head high. "I will not let my son's name be twisted into a lie," he said softly. "I will not let his death be just another file in your cabinet of secrets." And in that moment, with the sun catching on the journal's worn cover and the echo of his son's name in the air, Daniel Reed became more than a father. He became the voice for every soldier who never came home. At the edge of the field, Kate's fingers worked furiously over her laptop, her brows furrowed in concentration. The retired sergeant leaned over her shoulder, his eyes sharp. "How far is it reaching?" "Everywhere," she said, her voice low but steady. "I've sent it to every major outlet, every veterans group, every family who's ever had a reason to wonder." The footage on her screen played on a loop, the crack of live rounds, the chaos, the frozen, horrified faces. Each frame was a blade cutting through the silence. Kate's eyes flicked to the field where Daniel stood with the young corporal. "He's not just telling a story," she said softly. "He's tearing down a wall that stood for too damn long." The sergeant nodded, his jaw tight. "And Harmon knows it." On the screen, Harmon's face was a portrait of ruin, the proud commander crumbling under the weight of the truth. The camera caught every twitch of his jaw, every flicker of fear. "He's trying to find a way out," Kate murmured. "But there isn't one. Not anymore." The sergeant's hand closed into a fist. He buried too many sons to bury this. Outside, the crowd's voices rose like a tide, questions and demands, the fury of mothers and fathers who would not be silenced. Kate leaned back, her voice soft but unyielding. "This is just the start. Once this is out there, they'll never be able to close the door again." She clicked the final upload button, and as the broadcast spread like wildfire across the world, she whispered a promise into the cold, quiet air. "Let them see. Let them all see." Harmon gripped the podium with white-knuckled hands, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. His voice cracked as he tried to summon the calm he'd worn like armor for years. This is a distortion," he rasped, but no one believed him anymore. A father in the crowd shouted, his voice raw. "My boy trusted you." A mother sobbed, "How many more, Commander? How many more did you lie about?" Harmon's lips trembled. He looked down at his notes as if they could shield him, but the words were meaningless now, dead things on a page. His eyes darted to Daniel, who stood tall, the journal clutched to his chest like a flag. You're destroying everything we stand for. Harmon spat, his voice a whisper of venom. Daniel met his gaze, his voice cold and steady. No, you did that the moment you decided your pride was worth more than their lives. The crowd surged, voices rising in a crescendo of grief and fury. Harmon's shoulders slumped. His gaze flicked from the journal to the footage playing behind him. The final blow to every lie he'd built. The young corporal stepped forward, his voice calm but fierce. You told us we were expendable, but we're not. We never were. And now, you're the one who's done. Harmon's face crumpled. He turned away from the crowd, shoulders hunched, his proud posture gone. The medals on his chest glinted in the sun, hollow, meaningless shine. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low but carrying. James's blood, and every soldier you put in harm's way, is on your hands. And now the world knows it. And in that moment, as Harmon turned and walked away, his head bowed in defeat, Daniel Reed knew the battle was finally shifting. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was a roar that no one could silence. The air was electric with the energy of the crowd, no longer passive, no longer silent. They surged forward, voices rising, demanding answers. A woman with tear-streaked cheeks shouted, "We trusted you." Her voice cracked, but her fury didn't waver. A man beside her, his weathered face lined with decades of service, spoke with a quiet, deadly calm. "We wore the same uniform. And you disgraced it." Daniel watched, every muscle in his body wound tight. The journal clutched to his chest. He saw the cracks in Harmon's composure deepen, saw the weight of a lifetime of deception crash down around him. Harmon turned, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning in his own lies. I was trying to, no, the young corporal cut in, his voice ringing out like a clarion bell. You weren't trying to protect us. You were trying to protect yourself. The words cut through the air like a blade. The crowd fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over them like a shroud. Harmon's face blanched, his shoulders hunching. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low but clear. You used their loyalty, their trust. You turned it into a weapon. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned to Harmon, not with respect, but with a cold, righteous fury. The retired sergeant's voice rumbled from the back. The army's not yours to twist. The uniform's not yours to hide behind. Harmon opened his mouth, but no words came. And in that silence, Daniel knew. The truth had finally found its voice. The world was listening, and there was no going back. Harmon staggered back from the podium, the weight of the crowd's fury pressing in on him. The medals on his chest clinked softly, hollow echoes of the pride he'd built his career upon. He opened his mouth again, but the words faltered on his tongue. Daniel watched him with a calm that had taken months to forge. His breath was steady, his eyes clear as he stepped closer. Every page in here, every word James wrote, it's the truth you could never kill. His voice was soft, but it carried like thunder. Harmon's lips trembled. He lowered his gaze, his voice a rasp. I thought it was what they needed. No, Daniel said, his voice quiet and firm. It was what you needed, to feel powerful, to feel important. But those lives weren't yours to gamble with. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with every life Harmon had stolen with his arrogance. Daniel met the man's broken stare one last time and turned to the crowd. The truth is out, and it will never be hidden again. At the edge of the field, Kate worked the controls of the broadcast console with precision, her eyes bright with determination. The footage of the confrontation was already streaming live, the voices of the crowd and the power of Daniel's words echoing out to every corner of the internet. The retired sergeant stood beside her, his arms folded across his chest. They're watching, Kate, he said softly. Every family that ever trusted this uniform, they're watching. Kate's voice was quiet but fierce. Good. Let them see it. Let them understand what's been done in their name. She pressed a button, and a split screen appeared on the feed. Daniel's unwavering stance and the footage of the drills, the chaos, the live rounds, the truth that had been buried for so long. Every lie exposed, she whispered. Every shadow dragged into the light. Outside, the cold air seemed to hum with the energy of the moment. Families clutched each other's hands, tears glistening on weathered cheeks. The crowd wasn't just angry, they were united in a single, unbreakable demand. The truth would never be hidden again. Kate looked up, her eyes meeting Daniel's across the field. In that glance, she saw the culmination of everything they'd fought for, every sleepless night, every whispered conversation in the dark. And in the back of her mind, she knew this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning, a promise that every life lost would be honored, not with hollow words, but with the hard, unflinching truth. She clicked the final upload button, and the world watched. As the last words of Daniel's speech echoed through the field, a hush fell over the crowd. The finality of it, the absolute clarity of the truth, was like the stillness after a storm. Harmon stood off to the side now, a pale, trembling figure surrounded by the soldiers he'd once commanded. But they no longer looked at him with respect, only with the cold, measured weight of betrayal. The young corporal turned to Daniel, his voice shaking with relief and fear. "It's done," he said. They all saw it. Everyone. Daniel's shoulders sagged as he let out a slow breath. "It's done," he echoed. The retired sergeant stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "The system will try to bury this again, you know. They'll throw everything they have at you." Daniel nodded, his face lined but resolute. "Let them try. They can't bury the truth now. Not when the world has seen it." He turned to the crowd, his voice firm. "My son's name will not be remembered as just another accident. He was more than that." They all were. A ripple of nods, of quiet affirmations, moved through the crowd. In their eyes, Daniel saw the beginning of something stronger than any uniform or chain of command, a bond of truth and accountability. He thought of James, of the laughter, the light in his eyes, the courage that had brought them all here. And he knew, deep in his bones, that his son would be proud. In that cold winter morning, under the open sky, Daniel Reed stood not just as a father, but as a testament to the power of truth. And the world would never be the same. As the ceremony ended, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the energy, the resolve, still crackled in the air like static. Daniel stood quietly, the journal pressed to his chest, his breath steady and his shoulders square. The young corporal approached, his eyes filled with both relief and uncertainty. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hushed. Daniel looked out across the field, his eyes lingering on the fading footprints in the frost. "Now, we keep fighting," he said softly, "because the truth doesn't end here." Kate joined them, a quiet determination in her expression. "I've already sent the files to every journalist I know. This isn't going to fade away." The retired sergeant nodded. "We'll make sure of it. No more shadows. No more excuses." Daniel glanced back at the podium, where Harmon had stood so tall just hours ago, now abandoned, a hollow symbol of broken power. "He'll face the consequences," he said. "They all will." A hush fell for a moment, the kind of silence that spoke of something sacred. And then, as if the world itself was exhaling, the first rays of dawn slipped over the horizon, painting the sky in pale gold. Daniel felt a strange peace settle over him, not an ending, but a quiet strength. He thought of James, of the promise he'd made at his grave. "I won't stop, son. I won't let them forget." And he knew this was just the beginning of a reckoning, a dawn not of vengeance, but of justice. He took one last look at the field where his son's truth had finally come to light. And then he turned, his step steady and sure, toward whatever would come next. The sun had barely risen when Daniel found himself back at his kitchen table, the journal open in front of him. The dawn light glowed across the pages, each word a testament to James's courage. He ran his fingertips across the lines, as if trying to feel his son's presence in every loop of ink. The door creaked open and the retired sergeant stepped in, his face lined with exhaustion but a small, grim smile on his lips. "It's starting, Daniel," he said quietly. "News outlets are picking it up. Families are coming forward. Harmon's name is being dragged into the light." Daniel looked up, his jaw tightening. "Good," he murmured. "It's about time." He closed the journal, placing it carefully beside a framed photo of James, that bright, infectious grin that no one would ever forget. The young corporal slipped in next, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Mr. Reed." "I'm scared," he admitted, voice hushed. "What if they try to spin it again? What if they make us the villains?" Daniel studied him for a moment, then reached across the table and placed a hand on his shoulder. "They can try," he said softly. "But we have the truth now, and the world has seen it. They can't twist that." The corporal's breath shook, but he nodded, his eyes hardening. "Then I'll stand with you," he said. Daniel offered him a small, steady smile. "You already have," he said. They sat together for a long moment, the quiet between them not heavy but resolute. The sun rose higher outside, washing the walls in gold. Daniel thought of James, his laughter, his stubborn spirit, and felt the weight of the day shift in his chest. "Today is just the first step," he said quietly. "But it's a step that can never be undone." That afternoon, the phone rang, breaking the quiet with a sudden urgency. Daniel lifted the receiver, his voice calm. "This is Reed." A woman's voice crackled through the line, clipped, professional, but beneath it a tremor of emotion. "Mr. Reed, this is Captain Ellis. I'm part of the independent investigation panel, and I've seen the footage. I've read the reports." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his grip on the phone tightening. And there was a pause, a shaky breath. "And it changes everything," Captain Ellis said quietly. "We've already started calling witnesses. Harmon's entire command is under review, and not just for your son's death. There's a history here." Daniel felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. "I know," he said. "I've seen the history. It's written in every name they tried to forget." Captain Ellis's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I wanted you to know. We're going to push this as far as it will go. No more half-truths. No more excuses. A flicker of something, relief, pride, maybe even hope, lit in Daniel's eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "My son's name deserves nothing less." As he hung up, the retired sergeant stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What was that?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. "It was the first time someone in uniform actually said it out loud," he said. "That they see it, that they believe it." The sergeant's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then they'd better be ready," he said. "Because the truth doesn't bow to rank or medals." Daniel nodded, his fingers tracing the journal's spine. "No," he said. "It never has." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the air crisp and biting as Daniel walked through the small garden at the side of his house. Each breath of cold air tasted like promise, each step a quiet affirmation. He paused by a small wooden bench James had built when he was just a teenager, the wood worn smooth by time and memory. Daniel sat down, the weight of the last few days finally pressing in around him. The young corporal joined him, his eyes tired but clear. "You okay?" he asked hesitantly. Daniel gave a small smile, his eyes distant. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay," he said. "But I think, for the first time, I know I did what was right." The corporal nodded, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You did more than that, Mr. Reed. You gave us all a voice." Daniel looked at him, his expression softening. "James did that," he said. "He was the first to speak. I just made sure he'd be heard." The young man swallowed hard, his shoulders squaring. "Then I'll keep speaking too. For him. For everyone." Daniel reached out, clapping his shoulder. "That's all any of us can do." They sat in quiet companionship as the winter sun rose higher, warming the frost that sparkled across the grass. In the stillness, Daniel could almost hear James's laughter, a bright, defiant echo that would never be silenced. He closed his eyes, breathing it in. And in that quiet, he found a kind of peace. Late that night, Daniel stood at the window of his home, watching the stars burn bright against the velvet dark. The world felt different now, like a wound that had been lanced, the poison finally draining away. The retired sergeant joined him, his voice low. "They're talking about charges, you know. Courts-martial. Full hearings. Harmon, he's done." Daniel didn't smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his gaze. "Good," he said simply. "He took so much. He doesn't deserve to walk away from this clean." The sergeant exhaled, his shoulders easing. He won't. But it won't bring James back, Daniel. Daniel's eyes were distant, but calm. I know, he said softly, but it will keep someone else's son alive. That's enough. They stood in silence for a long moment, the night wrapping around them like a shroud. And then Daniel turned away from the window, the journal in his hands. I'm going to keep telling this story, he said. Every chance I get. Every time they try to bury it again. The sergeant's lips twitched in a faint smile. Then I'll stand beside you. Daniel looked at the photo of James on the mantel, that crooked smile, that light in his eyes. I'll never stop, he said quietly. Not for him. Not for any of them. And in that moment, in that quiet room, with the weight of everything they'd fought for heavy in the air, Daniel Reed knew that the reckoning had only just begun. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the journal open before him like an altar of memories. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a low, mournful song that matched the ache in his chest. He traced the words with a fingertip, each line a quiet echo of his son's voice. The retired sergeant stood at the counter, pouring 2 cups of coffee. You're not sleeping, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Daniel offered a wry smile. How could I? My mind, it won't shut down. Every moment feels like James is right here, whispering in the back of my head. The sergeant handed him a cup, his own eyes tired. He is here, he said. And every word, every breath. That's what you gave him, a voice that can't be silenced. Daniel stared down at the dark liquid, steam curling up like a fragile promise. I keep thinking about that last day, he murmured. About how he must have felt, scared, but still standing. The sergeant's voice was low, steady. He was a soldier, and he was your son. That's a strength most men never find. Daniel looked up, his expression calm. Then I'll find it for him. Every day, for the rest of my life. The 2 men sat in silence, the weight of the past and the promise of tomorrow settling over them. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside, there was a quiet strength, a resolve that would not be broken. Daniel reached for the journal again, his thumb brushing over James's final entry. I'll carry this until the day I die, he said softly, and I'll make sure the world never forgets his name. The next morning, the press conference was held in a cramped room at the courthouse, the air electric with anticipation. Cameras clicked and whirred, journalists leaning forward, pens poised like weapons. Daniel sat at the front, his hands steady on the table. Kate stood beside him, her calm voice filling the space. Today, we're not just telling a story, she said. We're telling the truth. The footage, the journal entries, all of it will be made public. No more hidden files. No more denials. Harmon was nowhere to be seen, but his absence only fueled the tension. Daniel felt the burn of 100 eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. This was the moment James had written for, the moment he'd refused to let die. A reporter leaned forward, her voice sharp. Mr. Reed, do you believe this will lead to real accountability? Daniel's voice was quiet, but it carried. I don't believe. I know. Because the truth doesn't care about rank or medals. It doesn't care how high you stand. It only cares how deep you buried the bodies. Murmurs spread through the room, but Daniel held his ground. This is for James. For every son and daughter who trusted their commanders to bring them home. Another reporter's voice, softer. And you, sir? What's next for you? Daniel's eyes met hers, clear and unwavering. What's next? I keep going. I keep telling the story. Because the moment we stop is the moment they win. And in that crowded room, with the weight of a nation's grief pressing down, Daniel Reed stood tall, a father, a fighter, a man who had turned loss into a battle cry that no one would ever silence. Weeks later, the courtroom was filled with a heavy, almost reverent silence. Daniel sat on the wooden bench, his hands folded over James's journal like a prayer. Harmon sat across from him, his uniform crisp, but his shoulders slumped, the mask of command stripped away. The young corporal took the stand first, his voice clear despite the tremor in his hands. We were told it was just another drill, he said. But it wasn't. We all knew, and Harmon knew. He ordered it. He watched it happen. Harmon's lawyer rose, his voice dripping disdain. Speculation. This is just hearsay, the corporal cut him off, his voice hardening. No, this is the truth. And you can't bury it with paperwork. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Daniel's breath caught in his chest as he watched the young man speak, the courage in his words a mirror of James's spirit. When it was Daniel's turn, he stood slowly, his hands gripping the journal so tightly his knuckles went white. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of every tear he'd ever shed. "My son trusted the system to protect him," he said. "But Harmon, he turned that trust into a weapon. And that's why we're here today, because my son's life wasn't expendable. None of them were." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "You can't kill the truth. You can't bury it under medals and uniforms. It lives here, in these pages, in these voices." And in that moment, Daniel felt something shift, the power of truth crashing down like a hammer, unbreakable and eternal. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courthouse thick enough to taste. Daniel sat quietly, his breath steady, the journal resting on his lap like an anchor. The retired sergeant sat beside him, his expression a fortress of calm. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his eyes forward, every muscle in his body taut with expectation. The foreman's voice was clear, each word a nail in the coffin of lies. On all counts, guilty. A collective exhale swept through the room, a shudder of relief and release. Harmon's shoulders sagged, his face ashen. For a moment, he looked like a man who'd finally seen the weight of every life he'd stolen. Daniel didn't look at him. He looked down at James's journal, his fingers tracing the worn edges. In that moment, he felt no triumph, only a quiet, unwavering peace. The young corporal leaned forward, his voice a hushed breath. "It's over," he said. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he said softly. "It's just beginning. Because the truth doesn't end here." Outside, the sky was clear, the winter sun sharp and bright. Daniel stood slowly, the journal held close to his heart. He stepped out into the cold air, each breath a promise, to James, to every fallen soldier, to the world. He would keep telling the story. He would keep the truth alive. And in that light, he would find his peace not in vengeance, but in the knowledge that his son's voice would never be silenced again. After the verdict was delivered, the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. Daniel lingered in the back row, the journal resting on his lap, his fingers absently brushing the edges. The weight of it all, the years of lies, the final break of silence, felt like a storm finally spent. The retired sergeant walked up, his voice a quiet rumble. "You did it," he said. "I steady. You gave him back his name." Daniel didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the empty bench where Harmon had sat moments ago, the commander's shoulders slumped in defeat. The truth had finally cut through, leaving him exposed and broken. "He gave me the strength," Daniel said eventually. "All I did was refuse to forget." The sergeant's lips curved into a thin, proud smile. "That's all it takes sometimes, to keep remembering when everyone else wants to move on." Daniel stood slowly, slipping the journal into his coat. Outside, he could see the winter sun glinting on the snow-dusted steps, the world looking so calm and bright in contrast to the fury that had been unleashed inside. As they stepped out, the air was sharp and clean. A few reporters lingered, but Daniel ignored them. He didn't need headlines or interviews. He needed the quiet, needed the memory of James to fill the silence. The young corporal caught up to them, his breath steaming in the cold. "Mr. Reed, I just wanted to say thank you," he said, "for not letting them bury him." Daniel turned to him, his voice soft but firm. "You were part of this. Don't forget that." The young man's shoulders straightened. "I won't," he said quietly. "Not ever." Together, they walked down the courthouse steps, the snow crunching underfoot, the truth a quiet echo that would never fade. Back at Daniel's small home, the air was warm and still. The kitchen table was scattered with letters, handwritten notes, printed emails, words from families who had seen the footage, who had recognized in Daniel's fight their own grief and fury. Daniel read each one slowly, carefully, as if every word were a prayer. My brother died in a training exercise, too. They called it an accident, but now I see it. My daughter trusted them, and they betrayed her. Thank you for making them see." The weight of those voices settled over him like a blanket, heavy but comforting in its shared pain. The retired sergeant sipped his coffee, his voice low. "You started something, Daniel. Something bigger than either of us. These people, they're ready to stand up, too." Daniel nodded, his thumb brushing over a letter written in a neat, looping hand. "They deserve to be heard," he murmured. "All of them. It's not just about James anymore. It never was." He thought of the ceremony, the trembling voices of mothers and fathers who had found their strength in his. He thought of the young corporal, standing tall despite the fear in his eyes. The voices of the fallen were no longer whispers. They were a chorus, a demand that could not be silenced. "Then we'll make sure they are," the sergeant said quietly. "Every last one." Daniel looked up, his eyes bright but calm. "We will," he said. "For them. For James. For every soldier who was never meant to be forgotten." A week later, Daniel stood at James's grave, the wind whipping around him like a promise. The headstone was simple, James's name, his rank, the years of his too short life. But there was something more there now, something Daniel could feel in the quiet that settled over the cemetery. He knelt, the journal in his hands. "I did it, son," he said softly. "I kept my promise." The snow crunched under his knees, cold seeping through his jeans. He didn't mind. This was a place of truth, of memory, no ceremony, no cameras, just a father and his son. I wish you could see it," Daniel whispered. "The way they all stood up. The way they refused to let your name be lost in the shadows." His voice cracked, but he kept going, the words a quiet benediction. "You were brave, James. You always were. And now the world knows it, too." He laid the journal gently at the base of the headstone, his breath misting in the cold air. "I'll keep telling your story," he promised. "I'll keep fighting, because that's what you would have done." For a long moment, he just knelt there, his head bowed. And in that quiet, he felt something shift, a soft warmth, like James's hand on his shoulder, like laughter carried on the wind. When he stood, the weight in his chest felt different, no longer crushing, but part of him. And he knew that wherever he went, James would be there, too. The next morning, Daniel woke to the soft light of dawn filling his room. For the first time in months, he felt the tightness in his chest ease, replaced by a quiet certainty. He dressed in a simple jacket, the journal tucked safely inside his coat. Outside, the world was waking up, birds singing, frost sparkling on the ground. He walked down the front steps, breathing in the crisp, cold air. The retired sergeant was waiting by the fence, his face lit by the first rays of sunlight. "Ready?" he asked. Daniel nodded, his eyes steady. "Ready," he said. They didn't need to say where they were going, back to the memorial, to the families who had gathered once more. There would be no confrontation today, no fight, just a chance to speak, to remember, to build something stronger from the wreckage of silence. As they walked, Daniel thought of all the letters, all the voices that had joined theirs. The story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever lost someone and refused to let them be forgotten. At the memorial, families stood in quiet circles, heads bowed, hands clasped. Daniel moved through them slowly, offering quiet words, sharing gentle smiles. The pain was still there, would always be there, but it was no longer something to be hidden. It was something to be honored. And in the soft winter light, as the world turned toward a new day, Daniel knew this was the legacy James had left him. Not just the fight for truth, but the courage to keep living, to keep telling the story. Because in the end, that's what justice really was, a promise to never forget. As Daniel and the retired sergeant reached the edge of the memorial field, a hush fell over the gathered families. Faces turned toward them, eyes wide with recognition and something else, something Daniel had seen flickering in his own reflection lately. Hope. A mother stepped forward, her hands clutching a small photograph of her son. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Because of you. I finally know what happened to him." Daniel met her gaze, his expression open and steady. "You deserve the truth," he said. We all do. She nodded, tears welling. And you deserve peace, too. He looked away for a moment, his throat tight. The sergeant touched his arm, grounding him. We're all in this together now, he murmured. Daniel drew in a deep breath, feeling the cold air settle in his lungs like a promise. Then let's make sure no one forgets, he said. They moved among the families, sharing quiet words and firm handshakes. Soldiers stood at the edges, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, their eyes solemn. One young man, no more than 20, met Daniel's gaze with a quiet reverence. Sir, my brother was in those drills, too. He made it home, but he's never been the same. Thank you for making sure someone listens. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. You tell him he's not alone, he said. None of you are. The young man nodded, his jaw set with a quiet resolve. And Daniel knew in that moment that the story wasn't his to finish alone. It had grown larger, bigger than any single man's grief or rage. It was a chorus now, and every voice mattered. As the morning sun rose higher, a small stage was set up on the field, a place not for spectacle, but for the quiet power of words. Daniel was invited to speak, and as he stepped up, he felt every eye on him, not in judgment, but in solidarity. He took a deep breath, the journal heavy in his hand. My name is Daniel Reed. He began, his voice steady, the words simple but fierce. I lost my son in a drill that should have never happened. They called it an accident, but it wasn't. The crowd listened, rapt and silent. The wind tugged at the flags behind him, the sharp snap of fabric echoing like a heartbeat. He was more than a soldier, Daniel continued. He was a son, a friend, a light that no lie could ever truly bury. He paused, his eyes sweeping the faces before him. Parents, siblings, friends, each one holding a grief that had been forced into the shadows for too long. And today, he said, we stand together to say, no more. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Kate moved among them, capturing every word, every tear. The retired sergeant stood at Daniel's side, a silent pillar of strength. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried in the cold morning air. We're here because we remember, because we refuse to let them forget, because we're done letting silence protect those who betrayed us. And in that quiet, Daniel felt something shift, a promise born not of vengeance, but of love, a vow that would outlast any uniform or rank. He stepped back from the podium, his shoulders squared. The fight wasn't over, but they were no longer fighting alone. After the gathering, Daniel lingered at the edge of the field, the weight of the journal warm in his hand. The young corporal joined him, his breath misting in the cold. It's strange, he said quietly, seeing them all here, hearing the truth spoken out loud. Daniel nodded. It's what they deserved. It's what we all deserve. The young man hesitated, then asked, do you ever wonder what James would say if he could see this? All of this. Daniel's throat tightened, but he didn't look away. I think he'd be proud, he said. Not just of me, of everyone who chose to stand up. The corporal let out a slow breath. He would have wanted this, for the truth to matter more than anything else. Daniel offered a small, quiet smile. That's the legacy he left me, he said. The courage to keep going, to keep speaking. They stood together in the pale sunlight, the world around them hushed and still. And in that quiet, Daniel felt something like peace settle in his chest. Not an ending, but a beginning. Promise me something, he said softly. The young corporal looked at him, brows drawn. Anything. Promise me you'll keep telling this story, Daniel said. Even when I'm gone. Even when the world tries to forget again. The young man's voice was firm. I promise. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the journal resting before him. He traced the cover one last time, feeling the shape of every word etched into the worn leather. He opened it, flipping through the pages until he found the final entry. James's handwriting still sharp and clear, a son's voice echoing across time. If something happens, don't believe them. Don't let them call it an accident. Please, Dad. Promise me. Daniel closed the journal, his breath catching in his throat. I promised, son, he whispered. And I kept it. The retired sergeant sat across from him, his eyes steady. "So, what now?" Daniel looked up, the lines of his face softening into something almost gentle. "Now, we keep going," he said. "The fight isn't over. There are more stories to tell, more voices that need to be heard." He looked out the window, where the stars burned cold and bright in the winter sky. "I thought this would be the end," he said softly. "But I see now, it's only the beginning." The sergeant's lips curved in a faint smile. "Then let's get to work." And in that quiet kitchen, with the journal of a fallen son and the unbreakable will of those who loved him, Daniel Reed knew one thing for certain: the truth could never be silenced. Not as long as even one voice remained to tell the story. The night was deep and silent as Daniel sat on his porch, a blanket draped over his shoulders. The winter air bit at his cheeks, but he welcomed it, feeling each breath sharp and clean in his lungs. In his lap, the journal rested, its pages a quiet testament to the boy he had loved and lost. He thumbed through it slowly, letting the words wash over him like a benediction. Each page was a memory, a promise, each line a lifeline that had pulled him through the darkness. The retired sergeant stepped out of the house, a mug of steaming coffee in his hands. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. Daniel shook his head, a small, wry smile on his lips. "I don't think I want to," he said. "Not tonight." The sergeant handed him the coffee, and they sat in quiet companionship, the sky above them a velvet dome of stars. The world felt so still, so peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm they had weathered together. "You did what you came here to do," the sergeant said finally. "You gave your son a voice, and you gave them all a chance to be heard." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It still doesn't feel real," he murmured. "Like, maybe I'll wake up and it'll be the morning after the funeral, and none of this will have happened." The sergeant's voice was steady. "But it did, Daniel, and no one can ever take that away from you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sounds the soft rustle of the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. Then Daniel closed the journal gently, holding it to his chest. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "tomorrow we move forward. But tonight, I just want to remember." And in that quiet, under the vast, endless sky, Daniel found a fragile peace, the first he had felt in so very long. The sun rose slow and soft, washing the sky in gold and pink as Daniel walked back to the field, the place where it had all begun and where it would find its final echo. Each step felt deliberate, the crunch of frost underfoot a steady rhythm in the quiet morning air. Families gathered once more, bundled in thick coats, their breath steaming in the cold. They greeted him with quiet nods, with eyes that shone with both pain and a newfound resolve. In their presence, Daniel felt the weight of the past lift, not gone, but lighter, carried together. The young corporal approached, his shoulders squared, his voice clear. "We're all here, Mr. Reed," he said. "For you, for him, for every one of them." Daniel offered a small smile. "No, we're here for each other," he said. "That's what this was always about." Kate stood at the edge of the gathering, camera in hand, her expression intent and respectful. She caught his eye and gave him a single, solemn nod, a promise that the story would continue long after today. The retired sergeant moved to his side, his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You ready?" he asked. Daniel looked out over the field, the place where the lies had been exposed, where the truth had taken root, the place where he had said goodbye to his son, not in defeat, but in defiance. "I'm ready," he said. As he stepped forward, the winter sun bathed the field in warm light, a quiet benediction. And Daniel spoke, not with anger, but with the calm, steady voice of a man who had found his truth. "This isn't an ending," he said. "This is a beginning. For every voice that was silenced, for every family that was told to forget, today we promise, we will remember. We will keep speaking." A quiet ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, a living heartbeat in the cold morning air. And in that moment, Daniel felt something bloom in his chest, not victory, but something deeper, something like hope. The winter sun rose higher as the last words of Daniel's promise echoed through the field. The air seemed to shimmer with a quiet energy, every breath a shared act of remembrance. The crowd stood close around him, mothers with trembling hands, fathers with tears in their eyes, soldiers standing at silent attention. Daniel's fingers traced the edges of James's journal, feeling the worn leather, the quiet weight of memory that would never fade. In that battered book lay every heartbeat of his son's courage, every echo of laughter and hope. It was more than a record of tragedy. It was proof that James had lived, had mattered. The retired sergeant moved to his side, his voice low and sure. "You gave them something they'd been waiting for," he said. "The truth. The right to stand up and be counted." Daniel nodded, his eyes distant as he looked out across the field. "We all gave them something," he said softly. "James. You. The young men and women who refused to be silent." The young corporal stood a few paces away, his eyes steady but wet with unshed tears. "My brother watched the stream," he said in a trembling voice. He said he finally felt seen. Daniel's throat tightened. "Then that's all I needed," he said. "That's what this was always about, not revenge. Not anger. Just to be seen." The wind rustled the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of earth and frost. In that small sound, Daniel felt James's laughter, the echo of his voice in every breath of the morning. "We carry them with us," he whispered. "Every day. Every step forward." The sergeant clapped a hand on his shoulder. "And that's what will outlast everything else," he said. "Not the uniforms. Not the medals. Just the truth." And in that moment, Daniel felt something like peace settle in his chest, the knowledge that James would never be forgotten, not as long as there was someone to keep speaking his name. The gathering began to break apart as the sun reached its peak, families turning to each other with quiet murmurs and gentle touches. But Daniel lingered, his eyes scanning the field, not for the past, but for the future. Kate approached, her camera slung over her shoulder, her expression soft but focused. "There's one last thing," she said quietly. "One last thing that matters more than any footage." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" She smiled faintly. "You gave them a voice," she said. "Now ask them to share it." Daniel looked out at the crowd, at the faces turned toward him with something like hope flickering in their eyes. He cleared his throat, his voice calm and measured but carrying the weight of everything they had built together. "I want to ask you all something," he said, his words ringing clear in the cold air. "Where are you watching from? Where are you standing with us right now? Tell us in the comments, because this story isn't just mine anymore. It's yours too." The question hung there like a beacon, a challenge and an invitation all in one. Daniel let it settle, let it breathe. And if you believe that truth matters, if you believe in the power of voices raised together, like, share, and subscribe, he said. Not because this is my story, but because it's our story. Every like is a promise that we will not be silent again. Every share is a torch carried forward. So join us, because together, we're unstoppable. His final words carried into the bright winter air, and for a heartbeat, the world felt both heavy and impossibly light. Because in the end, Daniel knew, the truth was a fire that would never go out, as long as there was even one spark left to carry it forward. And as he turned away, the journal clutched to his heart. He smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of quiet, defiant hope. So, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep in your bones, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because this journey, this fight for truth and memory isn't over. And we're just getting started.